What is masculinity? On the surface, this could be a rhetorical question because it's seemingly so obvious. But I want you to admit to yourself that you've probably never actually sat down and thought about it or answered this question for yourself, right? It's right under your nose. You're living with it every day. And yet, because of this, we never actually think to question it. But as you're about to find out here, there is actually a tremendous value to doing so because that leads us into a much deeper and more nuanced experience of being a man. Or if you're a woman watching this episode, of understanding the men around you. Towards the end of this episode, I'll also be dropping a powerful resource for men who want to develop a conscious approach towards their masculinity. So make sure you stick with me to hear more about that. My name's Jasper Brown, and welcome to The Conscious Masculine. My journey into manhood really started around my mid-20s. Of course, it started a lot before that, but this was the first moment in my life when I really started to grapple with this question consciously. Before that, I was just living through my experiences and making this transition into manhood, but I wasn't really thinking about it. I wasn't really trying to understand it in a deliberate sense. And it was really only as I left my country of origin here in Australia for the first times by myself, as I left the safety of my home and the nest, and I really started to expose myself to the world, and I began to see the limits of my education and my understanding around masculinity. Really, we can see that our culture programs us and gives us a certain understanding, a certain perspective. But as I started to discover, that also has very clear limits. Particularly here in the West, where we've really lost our rituals and our rites of passage that helped to assist boys making this transition into manhood. Much of this has really been stripped away from our culture. And it was that absence, this lack of initiation, which I think was in many ways the core drive behind my desire to leave. And that was really, I didn't know this at the time, but that was really the beginnings of my quest, my hero's journey, so to speak, which really came into effect at that stage of my life. Through this impulse to leave and travel and explore the world and define myself outside of the family system and the sort of close cultural environment that I was raised in. As a boy seeking to develop into manhood, I went exploring and started tasting and experimenting with different practices, looking for answers that my culture and my family had not been able to give me. This is when I really started to dabble and explore yoga, tantra. I found tantra early on in my quest, and this was really sort of starting to instill in me this understanding about this sacred dance between the masculine and the feminine, as opposed to what a lot of our culture will teach us, which is that there is this kind of symbiotic relationship between men and women. Obviously, we need each other, but there was also like a lot of dysfunction. It was very almost business-like in a certain reproductive sense. And my discoveries of the tantric teachings, and as I started to experience these workshops and really connect with other people doing this work, I found a very newfound appreciation for the sacredness within these archetypal characteristics that we typically call masculine and feminine, that this was actually something much deeper. I also found men's work, which really helped me to fill in the missing pieces and surround myself with other men who had a growth-oriented mindset and were seeking to understand themselves and share and collaborate and somehow support this process of masculine embodiment and meaning making and sense making around these bodies that we have, the issues that we experience in the world, especially in relationships, understanding women, navigating the complexities of life as a man, and talking about the deep sort of intrinsic and existential issues that we were facing. And this was an incredibly powerful and supportive process for me to go through. In my quest for understanding, I also fell into some very negative influences. I found a lot of information in the online space talking about men's issues, specifically the red pill. I also found myself getting influenced by certain gurus and influencers, like the Tate brothers, for example. I was actually almost close to joining their program and going down that path. Thankfully, as I was starting to listen to this information and get programmed by this information, as I started to put that stuff into practice in my own life, it led to some massive ruptures and failures in my relationships, which really highlighted not only the deficiencies and limitations of those perspectives, but also my own deficiencies and limitations as a man, which really forced me to go through a certain dark night of the soul and confront the man in the mirror and start to admit a lot of these things about myself, which I didn't want to admit, but was nonetheless forced to, because I couldn't disagree with the facts of what was happening in my life, although I tried to turn a blind eye for as long as I possibly could until I was really forced to put my nose in it. And since then, as a men's coach, working with hundreds of men from around the world in this work that I'm doing, I've had a lot of time to experience various perspectives and approaches, and I've really started to add a lot of depth to my understanding of masculinity and what it means to consciously approach this experience or this endeavor, this direction of development, which I'm about to share with you. As always, my aim is not to impose my worldview on you, but rather to give you a certain perspective, my perspectives, as a starting point for your own evaluation and your own process of self-reflection and self-discovery. Please don't just take my word for it or believe what I say. You actually have to do some original thinking and through that generate your own insights, your own definitions, your own perspective, just as I have. So, with that preface out of the way, let's begin with this question of what is masculinity? In order to understand what a conscious approach to masculinity might look like, we really need to boil it down to the basics and the fundamentals. Now, essentially, in my view, masculinity is a cluster of characteristics that we collectively agree upon as a society as being associated with males, typically. This refers to qualities such as strength, integrity, leadership, independence, responsibility, discipline, stability, loyalty, provision, protection, competence, rationality, and assertiveness. Now, just notice that you've probably never boiled it down into such precise characteristics in your life before. In our culture, it tends to be much more nebulous and undefined. And it also gets coupled with a lot of baggage and negative associations, as well as your own personal biases, your own perspectives based on your own life experience so far, right? And on the other side of the coin, we have the feminine, which is typically empathetic, nurturing, intuitive, emotionally expressive, creative, flexible, receptive, sensitive, collaborative, patient, gentle, supportive, and connected to nature. It's also important to note that these qualities are not limited by gender. We obviously have a mixture of these qualities that exist inside us, different combination, different overlapping qualities, and sometimes complete inversions of those qualities respective to gender. Sometimes we have men who are much more feminine developmentally and energetically. And we also have women more in their masculine, especially these days when we now see women occupying traditionally masculine roles in society, in business, or even in family systems. But the masculine and feminine traits tend to be statistically distributed towards men and women respective to gender, just as a broad observation, and especially throughout most of human history. Typically, men were more masculine and women were more feminine. Although, of course, now this is definitely changing and definitely up for review, and these concepts are evolving. Simply the fact that these categories are now different than they used to be shows that the way we define them is not something that is fixed, but rather it's a fluid and adaptable and subjective concept depending on the society and the time period that we're actually living in, which is interesting. Which means that they are in fact social constructs, as we often hear today, that gender is a social construct. And yet it's not that simple. Those constructs are something that have a long history of collective validation and use. The categories in general that society uses, these constructs, so to speak, they evolve over tens of thousands of years because they are distinctions that are very useful. And somehow there is a part of them that is actually grounded in reality, that people have been reaching to and referring to and using over millennia. They do represent something concrete, something that we agree upon for the most part, similar to the way in which we look at money, which is also a social construct, which we have collectively agreed upon because it allows for the proper functioning for the exchanges of value, goods, and services. Now, for most of human history, masculinity has been associated with strength, courage, leadership, these kind of qualities. Basically, from the earliest societies that humans had, from the foraging and the agrarian eras, right up until the Industrial Revolution, basically, late 1800s, prior to which the majority of people were working the land. Most of the men were living lives dedicated to working the land in order to provide enough food to live. And men were often sent to either defend their lands or go to war against other factions, ethnic tribes, or nation states. Because of this, masculinity was synonymous with protection and provision. And it's only after the Industrial Revolution that started to actually change. When we as a culture and society started to invent machines that could replace the need for brute force labor, which was up until that point mainly provided by men. It was the Industrial Revolution that really allowed the moral and economic development necessary for women to start entering the workforce, which eventually gave rise to feminism. And it's also changed yet again in the informational age, when so much of our workforce and our culture has adapted and shifted into the online space. Now, I mention these points to illustrate that the role that men have been playing within society has been exposed to a very rapid and disruptive revolution in our entire mode of culture and economic production, which has changed things drastically in a very short period of time, just the last couple of 100 years, basically. Now, the full extent of that, we're obviously still grappling with. And in this modern age that we live in, we have this dramatic evolution in the social norms, the gender roles, and the family structures that we're living in and experiencing on a daily basis. All of that has been flipped on its head in just a few generations, especially in the West. And really, we can see the impact of feminism, which in the last 100 years has started to radically redefine masculinity as women were redefining themselves. Women really started to embody and step into traditionally masculine roles and started to adopt traditionally masculine qualities. More and more and more as they sought to emancipate themselves from the rigid roles of the past. I recently did an episode on why women were so angry and how much hurt and frustration and pain women still experience because of this inequality. If you want to understand your wife, your girlfriend, your lover in a much deeper way, definitely go and check out that episode. And in this process, this rapid and disruptive process of change that has occurred in the last couple of 100 years, and especially the last 100 years, men have found themselves massively disturbed by this change. Which is very understandable, because if your value as a man used to be protecting and providing, and that was the basis or the foundation of your sense of self, your masculinity, and that has been somehow stripped away from you in the eyes of a lot of women who do not need that from men anymore. Women are more than capable of providing for themselves. They live in relatively safe societies. They don't need necessarily the protection of men anymore. Of course, men find this threatening, because we have to then ask ourselves, well, what value do I actually bring to the table? If I don't need to protect her and I don't need to provide for her anymore, why does she need me? Apart from if she wants to have a child, but even then she doesn't need me anymore. So a lot of men have been left scratching their heads and resist this change, often quite aggressively. In the West, especially, this has created a swing towards the integration of the feminine in a lot of men in our generation. Women have stepped more into the masculine and started to integrate those qualities. Men have swung in the other direction and started to integrate the feminine. That's why we see a lot more men staying at home, being stay-at-home dads, and embracing that change. Developing qualities like emotional intelligence, empathy, and vulnerability. These qualities are starting to be integrated into the modern view of masculinity, because times are changing. The world is changing. Women are changing. And we as men are being forced to change in this process, whether we like it or not. Now, it's also at this point that a lot of men, especially those with a more conservative perspective on life, will push back against this. They really stand up and petition a regression or step back into traditional gender roles. And you see many people still living this. And many women still choose this. And in many parts of the world, that completely makes sense, since most of the world isn't actually or necessarily safe or developed enough to do away with those traditional norms. Especially outside the West, where things are not as culturally progressive. And in fact, tradition itself exists for a reason, because that's how humans have done it for thousands of years. And we're not taught to fuck around with that too much, because history has shown that the world is in fact a very dangerous place. Things are done in a specific way because we've learned that that's a safe way to do things, or the right way to do things, so to speak. Which is very interesting to observe. It's very important to note as well that every new stage of human development is resisted. It doesn't come easily. It's always resisted by the values and the worldview and the belief systems of the previous stages, who do not want change. Or for their very good reasons, they fear change. And that is an essential part of the conservative worldview, which the majority of the world is more conservative than the West. Less tolerance to open-mindedness or progressive ideas. because liberalism is only a byproduct of things when development gets to a certain stage and we actually have the abundance and the safety necessary to expose ourselves to brand new ways of doing things, because there is an inherent risk associated with that. Most people are not at that stage. Most people would prefer to cling to the traditions of the past, their belief systems, their religion, and stay with what is tried and true. And that's a very interesting characteristic to observe within complex systems as a part of systems thinking. Now, on top of all of this, we've obviously got the emergence of our culture and our society into the information age. We have this whole debate, whole discussion online around masculinity, femininity. All of these issues get intensely polarized and they become extremely contentious topics. The online world is an intense melting pot of global culture that has suddenly become connected, intimately connected. And within that is all of the different stages of human development warring against one another. All the different meme tribes, echo chambers, political ideologies, left versus right, liberal versus conservative, democracy versus communism, men versus women, red pill versus feminism. And all of the stages of development that basically clash with one another in this online space, all of which have their own views, their own norms around masculinity and the roles of men and women, all of which will defend their views to the death, because that's their way of seeing it. And remember, most people find it very, very difficult or even next to impossible to entertain the views and perspective of others. It's simply too threatening to their own perspective. They actually see other perspectives that are so different to theirs as a direct threat on their way of life, their belief system, or their religion. And just that insight alone goes a long way to explaining the levels of intense polarization that we see in the online space. Now, on top of that, we also have all of the masculinity gurus and influencers out there who preach their various narratives. We see a lot this alpha, beta mindset around men. There is the men who are in the alpha tribe, who are the strong leaders, successful with women, dominant, domineering. And we have the beta males who are much more subservient, much more easily manipulated. We have these kind of narratives, which personally I believe is quite toxic and not very useful for understanding an issue as complex as masculinity. It's very simplistic, binary, black and white, whereas in my view, it's way more gray. There is so many nuances and perspectives to integrate. It's, childlike in a certain way. We often have the influence, which is often very manipulative and exploitative towards pickup artistry and dating, where men are conditioned or educated in a certain view towards meeting their base sexual needs in a very kind of game-like fashion, which also influences a huge proportion of men and their approach towards women and how they define themselves. We also have the red pill, which is basically born from men's rights issues, which was very positive in a sense because men were underrepresented, especially post-feminism, when the spotlight was very much shifted onto women. A lot of men felt left out and that their pain wasn't getting seen. And initially the red pill was an answer to that, which was very good. Because obviously to fix women's issues, we also need to include men in that discussion. And in order to include men, we need to make sure that men's pain and voices also get heard. That's only fair, and that's the way to resolve conflicts. But it also contains a lot of misogyny and victim-villain narratives around men and women, the red pill, and has a lot of, we could say, more toxic influence on men's meaning making and sense making around masculinity. And that's something that I definitely fell into and found myself very influenced by. And in general, a lot of that, and in general, content online is very often designed and marketed in such a way that it like hooks in to the specific wounds and pain points that we have. Therefore, that's how it speaks to us, because it talks to our pain. And obviously, when we do that, men feel validated. Women feel validated in their pain when our pain gets spoken to. But that's very easily corrupted. That's very easily manipulated. And it's very easily pushed in a direction of being one-sided. We're right, they're wrong. I'm a victim, they must be the villain. Again, a very binary black and white way of seeing things, which doesn't really reflect the truth, in my opinion. The truth is everyone is right. Both sides deserve to get seen. In order to understand the full picture, we need to include every component of that picture, which is both sides, or all perspectives. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is equally right. That's a whole nother discussion, which we'll save for another time. But we need to be inclusive in our perspective and in our meaning making if we want to have the big picture perspective. Now, I bring these examples and point to these things just to illustrate the fact that the environment in which men are trying to make sense of their masculinity is very complex, very, very polarized, with a lot of different voices, different influences, different perspectives, and it's not necessarily easy for us to find our way. I myself spent years swimming and searching in those waters for the answers that I was looking for. And what I found was very often partial perspectives that led to disempowering ways of looking at the situation, or even outright toxic ways. That's the effect it had on me, and I've seen that echoed in so many men who got lost, who followed very bad advice, very partial advice, very polarized, wounded advice, and it ultimately didn't serve them. And I really found this out the hard way myself as I tried to explain as I tried to really explore what I was learning and implement that in my life. The results backfired tremendously and led to often disastrous consequences in my relationship. Following the red pill, following guys like Andrew Tate, taking this more pickup artistry approach towards women and relationships, I started to become more dominant, more confident, more controlling, and that wound into me being manipulative, losing respect, disconnecting from myself, As I tried to be stoic and alpha, I was removing my connection to my heart, to my ability to empathize, to my deeper state of caring, to a certain responsibility that I had to take care of the people that I claimed to love. A lot of this information fed my ego, making me think that I was someone. And I soon found myself pretending to be someone who I was not, and who I, in fact, didn't actually want to be. And I think deep down, what I was searching for was a conscious approach towards manhood, towards relationships, and towards life. At the time, however, I was hurt. I was wounded. I'd made enough mistakes, and I'd been on the receiving end of a lot of unskillful behavior, which left me feeling very disempowered and jaded. And so obviously the red pill ideology found hooks in me. It spoke to my pain. And then I onboarded a whole belief system and narrative around women that was ultimately very disempowering and very unhealthy. And I think this is a search that is echoed by so many men of really struggling and looking and seeking to find a path that would actually lead them towards healing, lead them towards a feeling of empowerment, and give them the skills and tools necessary to help them actually create healthy, vibrant relationships and an amazing life. And that really was the motivation for me to step into this work that I'm doing. That was really what inspired me to create this path, create this content, and share my lessons on my path towards becoming a more conscious man. In the hope that what I'm going through, my experiences, my lessons, and what I teach would also support other men to do the same and would give them the tools that I struggled to find. And that's really how the podcast, this channel, my work, and the men's groups and the online community that I run were conceived. The more I thought about this topic, I really started to understand that the global environment in which masculinity is now being experienced and lived through is changing. It's not what it used to be. And it's also massively confusing for young boys and men who are making that transition into manhood, because we're fed all sorts of mixed messaging. And we really don't get that much guidance. Our culture really no longer has those rites of passage and initiation that helped boys find their place among groups of men and internalize their qualities and the culture. Boys used to get sent off at a certain stage when we lived in a tribal environment to go and hunt with the men. They would leave for weeks or months at a time to go off into the wilderness with a group of men to camp and run and hunt together. We don't have that anymore. Instead, we're initiated into manhood via YouTube, or perhaps via our sports culture. And if we're lucky, we had a good group of friends around us, or we had a father who did a halfway decent job in modeling masculinity for us. But for most of us, we didn't even have that. So unfortunately for most men these days, this process of defining ourselves as men and transitioning from boys into manhood is really on our shoulders, and it's really left to us to fill in the missing pieces and develop our own path. And on that path, we either default to the narrative that our society gives us and the stereotypes of the past, and we cling to the traditional understanding and the landscape in which masculinity is being expressed, which is totally fine. If that feels like the right thing to you, then that's something you should pursue. But if there is a question mark over this topic, if there is a yearning that exists inside of you, you also have at your disposal the opportunity to become aware of the changes in the world and that our culture is going through, and to bring an open mind to this exploration of manhood, and in doing so, evolve your understanding of masculinity. Because there is much, much more there if you choose to explore. And in my view, a conscious approach towards masculinity means that we approach it with awareness. We approach the experience deliberately, with intentionality. We experience it fully somehow. We aim to actually evolve our understanding and live by certain principles, and not just leave it up to chance or how we feel in the moment or just winging it somehow. And I think that is really crucial for personal growth and healthy relationships. If you actually want good results and you want to improve, you need certain principles to live by. I did a whole episode as well on the most important principles for success in life. Highly recommend going back and watching that episode. Some of the most profound principles that I've discovered for myself and am following to live the great life. But in terms of masculinity, I think some of the core components that we need to align ourselves with is, first of all, integrity. Actually aligning our actions with our values and beliefs and how we feel. I also did a whole episode on how to develop integrity. This is super crucial, and in order to reach that, we actually need to understand what our values are, because it's not just a given. It's another area which we tend to assume. We all have those values, but actually making them explicit and writing them down and defining them for yourselves, man, that is a game changer. We need to develop emotional intelligence if we are to approach masculinity in a conscious way, because emotions are ruling our life, whether we admit that or not. We love to pretend that we are rational beings, but most of our decision-making processes, in fact, our entire life is governed by our emotions. Therefore, we need to become aware of how our emotions influence us and dictate all of the decisions that we do. Otherwise, we're basically on autopilot and we are not in control of our emotions. Our emotions are in control of us. Another important key principle for conscious masculinity is authenticity. Being true to yourself. Having the capacity to truly express what you feel, what you think, what you believe. And how to live authentic to that, aligned with that, honest and open, vulnerable and true. to yourself. And unfortunately, authenticity is a quality that gets conditioned out of us by society. And the path of rebuilding that or reestablishing or developing authenticity is a long, arduous process, because that conditioning runs very, very deep. And in order to heal that, we need to do a lot of deep inner work. But the benefits of which are priceless. In order to develop conscious masculinity, we also need to learn how to balance ourselves internally. We need to learn to integrate the masculine qualities that I've been discussing with you and sharing. We need to actually maximize and fully embody those qualities. And we actually need to balance that with the feminine energetic qualities as well. They all exist inside of us in different predominances. And in order to be a fully integrated being, we want to have access to both. We don't want to just be rigidly defined as one or the other. Actually, the greatest strength lies in a deep integration of both. And that is a very powerful concept to unlock. And we'll definitely have an episode about that in the future, talking about the nuances and how to actually do that. Another key principle for conscious masculinity is developing responsibility, learning how to actually take accountability for your actions and how those impact other people. A very humbling attitude to take. Requires that you go beyond your desires and actually start caring about something bigger than just you. Those are just a few of the qualities that I think are core components of developing a conscious approach towards masculinity. I could go on and on and on. And it's really the development of these qualities that I've really tried to build into my online course and the resources that I create for men. I talk about it on this channel and the podcast a lot as well. And I'm going to keep banging on about this because it's so important. Hearing it is one thing. Hearing me talk about it and hammering it into your mind, repeating it again and again, is crucial. And the conscious masculine community and the online course that I've built is another key step in that process that's going to help you turn the theory into practices, into concrete exercises that you actually go through. And as you go through them, they change your perspective. You deepen your understanding. You connect those dots in new ways with concrete examples and find actionable steps to take that deeper in your own life. I built that course so I would have something concrete that actually supports the theory and gives men who want to take this path structure and accountability and a specific process to go through. It was exactly this that was for me missing in the content that I found online, the education that I received in school, and even the role modeling I received from my father and from the men and other boys that I grew up with. There was no specific process. There was no initiatic ritual. There was no real guidance on how to be a man. So that is what I've really tried to create and what I'm building here in this work that we're doing. And today I bring this topic up because I'm in the process of launching and really taking this to another level and making this work more and more publicly accessible. And obviously the invitation is, if you're a man listening to this and you want more support and a structured approach and accountability and other men around you doing this work, that is an incredibly powerful resource that can help you to facilitate this process of growth and development. We've got modules that basically range from developing self-awareness, sharpening that to a high degree, healing the wounded boy that exists inside of you, how you need to go about this process of developing authenticity, building healthier relationships and the skills that we need in order to do that, and how to discover your life's purpose so you actually have a direction for your growth and development. And perhaps one of the most important things of all, which is raising your level of consciousness. This is all nestled within a men's community where we meet every week, twice a week, and have group meetings and talk about these topics and really put the theory into practice. So if that's something that resonates with you or would resonate with a man that you know, obviously the invitation is to come and check it out. You'll find the link to find out more about the course and how it is all structured and how it works and what's included in the link below this video. At the moment, I'm offering a founder's price, so it's never going to be as easy or accessible to join. I will increase the value as the course gains more and more traction and the community grows. I hope you found this topic interesting and it has given you some food for thought, and that this really kickstarts your own process of questioning this stuff for yourself. I'm going to be talking about this a lot more as we develop the show and the episodes go on. I'll be pulling apart all of the main principles and really building out a structured approach and a holistic, integrative understanding here. That's what this project is all about, is really mapping all of this out for you. I hope you will subscribe to the podcast, and I would love to hear in the comments what you thought about this episode. It really helps to give me feedback on the direction that I'm taking this and the things that I'm including. Really so important for me to get feedback from you guys about what's working, what's not working. I really read all the comments and take it to heart and use that every time I prep for an episode. It takes me hours and hours to get all of this stuff ready and put this together. So yeah, would love to hear your feedback and really appreciate your support. Now, as always, I'm going to leave with a few final insights on this topic. The word masculinity by itself is actually very loaded. Have you noticed that? Every person brings their own unique perspective based on their experiences and their own usually unconscious personal definition of masculinity. It has a lot of loading in the current online space, especially. And because of that, I really encourage you to define it for yourself. Just like you should define everything for yourself and not just blindly spoon feed yourself with what culture decides or hands to you. Don't just be a parrot repeating the ideology and perspectives of the people around you or the gurus that you listen to or the teachers or whoever it is that you put up on that pedestal. This work that I'm offering and this, my perspective here is one that you need to become an original thinker and start actually contemplating this stuff for yourself. Don't just listen to me. Don't listen to anyone. I mean, listen, but don't just onboard whatever they say as an ideology. You have to think for yourself. Take many perspectives, expose yourself to many perspectives, and then come back and do your own process of actually figuring out what you want, what you believe, what you think is right. Ultimately, masculinity is a concept that changes over time. We've seen that. But it can also be an incredibly useful tool for us because it helps us to orient our development, the development of your character within the context of the time that you're living through and the environment that you live in. For me personally, it's become a tool that I use to orient my development because I've made the decision to play this male character that you see before you and level him up as much as possible. And that is an extremely rewarding way to live. Now, if we look at history, we can see that masculinity, or men, have been responsible for many of the world's problems, so much pain, and a lot of unconscious infliction of suffering and trauma. You get to decide for yourself if you want to continue that and be an unconscious man living your life, or you can be a source of healing, conscious growth, and actually break the cycles of trauma and pain that have been passed down from generation and arriving at you. And in which then your unique version of masculinity can become a symbol that stands for integrity, balance, responsibility, authenticity, leadership, and consciousness. Because I think we can all agree that the world needs more men like that. Don't you think?